Good afternoon, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from London, Canada on July 8th, 2024. A few weeks ago, I was invited by some friends from the Muslim community in Toronto to participate in a series of speaking events to be held in Toronto in July to commemorate Muharram. Muharram is the first month in the Muslim calendar and one of the 4 sacred months in Islam. I was happy to accept their invitation, and after giving it some thought, I decided to devote my speech, which took place in Toronto last night, to the subject of the right of oppressed peoples to resist their oppression, if necessary, by force. A few hours before I showed up at the venue last night, I was contacted by the organizers who wanted to let me know that they had learned from social media postings that Mayor Weinstein intended to show up at our venue last night with a bunch of Zionist agitators. If you do not know that name, Mayor Weinstein was for many years the leader of the Jewish Defense League in Canada, and for a time was believed to be the leader of the JDL in all of North America. About 2 decades ago, the FBI recognized the JDL as a terrorist group, and since then, the Jewish Defense League has been implicated in a number of violent controversies both in the United States and Canada, including the savage beating of an elderly Palestinian man in Washington, D.C. a few years ago. When the organizers contacted the police this weekend to inform them of Weinstein's intentions, they were surprised to learn that the police actually knew about his plans for about 5 days, but for reasons that the police did not explain, they never informed the organizers, nor did they inform me of Weinstein's intentions. Sure enough, when I showed up at the venue last night, Mayor Weinstein was there, as were a handful of Zionist troublemakers. The police were also there in presence, and although there was some noise made outside the venue before the event began, fortunately there was no violence. The event went off without a hitch, and I'm about to share with you some footage of our interactions with Weinstein and his fellow agitators, and the full video of my speech last night. I hope you'll find it informative. We meet again. Still supporting the genocide, are you?
Stand fighting behind the mainstream media. All your lies has been exposed. Expose some people. There you go. That is your book. You have no morals. You have no morals. When you swear, that means you lost.
Thank you very much for conferring upon me the honor to speak this evening, and I'm quite touched to be the opening act for the Sheikh, and I look forward to his keynote speech. The first time that I met Mayor Weinstein, this gentleman, and I use the word loosely, who is outside agitating for the genocidal regime, was in 2016 when I was a member of the Green Party of Canada Shadow Cabinet, and I brought forward a resolution supporting BDS, and over the opposition of the party's leader at the time, Elizabeth May, and the current leader, it passed. It was a motion calling for the party to do the conscientious thing and support the BDS movement. And I gave a speech at Beit Satoon, which at the time was being operated by my wonderful friend, Robert Massoud. And outside at the event was Mayor Weinstein and other pro-Israel agitators, and so it's kind of fitting and appropriate that he's here again today. And I want to share with you a little story about my various interactions with this former leader of the terrorist Jewish Defense League. About 5 years ago, I gave a speech outside the US consulate in Toronto about the US government's support for the apartheid state. And Mayor Weinstein was there. We've crossed paths many times, and I was staying at a hotel about a kilometer from the US consulate in downtown Toronto, and when I finished my speech, I walked back to the hotel, and unbeknownst to me, Mayor Weinstein was following me. And when I got to the hotel, I did my daily routine. I checked in, I went into the gym, I started working out, and when I came out of the gym, on the mezzanine level, there was a little lounge area with some couches and armchairs, and there was nobody sitting there but one person, and that person was Mayor Weinstein. So I sat down beside Mayor Weinstein, and I decided to engage him in a conversation. And he started by challenging me on this question of whether the Jewish people, our brothers and sisters in the Jewish community, are indigenous to the land of Palestine. And I did not disagree with him. The concept of indigeneity is complex, and I would not take the position that the Jewish people have no claim to being indigenous to the land of Palestine. But I decided to perhaps prompt him to think differently about this issue by personalizing it to myself. And what I told him was that my ancestors, the Lascaris family, have very deep connections to Constantinople, which is today Istanbul. And in fact, 800 years ago, when the Crusaders sacked Constantinople, which at the time was the seat of the Byzantine Empire, a man by the name of Theodore Lascaris, it's reputed, briefly became the emperor before the Catholic Crusaders destroyed the seat of the Byzantine Empire. And I pointed this out to Mayor Weinstein, and I said, according to your logic, we, the Greeks, the descendants of the people who were dispersed from Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, have the right to go back and to murder and maim and oppress our Turkish brothers and sisters who've lived there for centuries because we had some distant connection, a deep connection, a very important historical connection, but a deep connection to that land. And I categorically reject that. To me, as a Greek and someone, although I'm not religious, but someone who was raised in the Greek Orthodox faith, I would categorically oppose any attempt by any Greek to go back to what is today Istanbul and to try to expel by violence our Muslim and Turkish brothers and sisters who now live there and have lived there for centuries. This is anathema to me. And I'm proud to report that Mayor Weinstein was stumped. He had no response. And I thought for a moment the optimist in me wanted to believe that maybe that would cause him to reflect upon his racist colonial views, but sadly, as we can see today, nothing appears to have changed. Now, about 3 weeks ago, a scandal erupted at McGill University in Montreal. And the scandal was that a Palestinian encampment there, which had been set up by conscientious students supporting the Palestinian cause, they had posted online a photograph of several what appeared to be young Palestinians wearing keffiyehs, covering their faces in keffiyehs, 5 or 6 of them reading a book, and 2 or 3 of them appeared to be holding automatic weapons. And the president of McGill erupted in indignation. And he said, this poster is extremely alarming. This is only the latest escalation in SPHR's, this is the Palestinian organization on campus, its long-standing strategy of intimidation and fear. Now, I wonder, what would his reaction have been if the poster had been put online by a campus organization like Hillel, and it featured Israeli soldiers holding automatic weapons? I very much doubt that the august president of McGill University, Deep Saini, would have expressed alarm and talked about this as though it was an international incident scandalizing this institution of higher learning. Now, I've come back recently from a lengthy trip to West Asia. I visited numerous countries there, including Palestine. I went to South Lebanon 3 times in the past 8 months. My first visit was a week after the attacks on October 7th. I went to Amman in Jordan. I went to Baghdad, and I met with members of the resistance movement there. I was in Qatar. And my purpose in going was to be, as the Greeks say, because it's a Greek word, a martyras, a martyr. And in the ancient Greek language, a martyras is a witness in the legal sense of the word. A martyras gives testimony in a court of law with the objective of obtaining justice for those who have been wronged. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what I saw there because frankly it changed me profoundly. First, I went to the occupied West Bank and I met a long-time and dear friend of mine, a Palestinian-Canadian artist by the name of Rehab Nazal, who, by the way, was shot by an Israeli sniper about 6 years ago as she was filming an Israeli skunk trunk in Bethlehem. And when the Palestinian ambulance came to her aid, the Israeli forces in Bethlehem rained tear gas down upon the ambulance. And this is a subject of another episode of our interactions with the Canadian government. I won't go down that path, but this is how I came to know Rahab. And Rahab, for the second time in my life, took me on a tour of the occupied West Bank, the first time having been in 2016. And the first place we went to was the refugee camp of Jenin. Rahab has family there and has had family in the area of Jenin for generations. And then we went to the refugee camp of Tulkarm. Now, in Jenin, what did I see? I could go on for days about what I saw, but I'm going to focus upon the things that were most impactful for me personally. First, hours after the Israeli forces raided the home of a family in Jenin, a refugee camp, we visited the home. When we showed up, the door had been blown off. The mother and the father and two of their sons were sitting in the kitchen. They looked extremely distraught. There was broken glass everywhere. Furniture had been destroyed. And the mother and the father recounted to me that hours earlier, the Israeli forces showed up. They used explosives to destroy the door to their home. They found their three sons in their bedroom, and they beat them savagely while they held the mother at the door as a human shield, because they were concerned that Palestinian militants would attack them as they were ransacking the house. Then on the following day, we learned that Israeli forces had shot dead two young men at the hospital in Jenin. So we went to the hospital, and we managed to speak with the director of the hospital, the Jenin hospital, and we sat in his office and we interviewed him. And in the course of the interview, he pulled out his iPhone and he showed us video camera footage of the shooting. And what it showed unequivocally was that when shooting erupted in the courtyard outside the emergency entrance to the hospital, young Palestinian men who were seeking refuge in the courtyard fled into the hospital, and one of them was shot in the back. Immediately as he entered the emergency entrance, we saw this on camera, he collapsed in a pool of blood, and an incredibly courageous medic picked him up, his body was limp, and began to drag him away from the entrance where he might be shot again, and it was absolutely crystal clear that he was not carrying any weapon. He was shot in cold blood in the back, and he died on the spot. In Jenin, we were taken to the shrine to the Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, and we saw that the Israeli forces had destroyed it, defiled it. And we were told that they did it again and again. The camp's residents came out as a sign of respect. They tried to restore the shrine, but every night the Israelis would come back and destroy it again. We spoke to the director of a theater in Jenin, a wonderful man who explained that after the October 7th attacks, the Israeli forces came into the camp, arrested all of the employees of the theater, beat them savagely, took them to a detention camp where some of them were tortured. He fortunately was eventually released, but colleagues of his had disappeared and he didn't know what their fate was at the moment when we spoke to him. And he pointed out to us that the theater, a small theater but a lovely theater, where somehow the camp residents of Jenin managed to find moments of calm in order to celebrate Palestinian culture, that this little theater was supposed to be expanded on a plot of land near the entrance to the Jenin refugee camp, but they couldn't use that plot of land now because it had to be converted to a cemetery, because the Israelis had killed so many of the camp's residents since October 7th. In Tulkarm, we visited a daycare center and saw clear signs, plenty of evidence that it had been used as a daycare center, which had been leveled to the ground by an Israeli airstrike. We met a Palestinian resistance fighter, a 19-year-old militant who was carrying an automatic weapon. He was extremely gracious to us, although he was curious because he knew that we were not from the camp, to know why we were there. And we found out 3 days later that he had been shot dead by Israeli forces on one of their nightly incursions into the camp. We saw in both Jenin and Tulkarm that every night the Israeli forces come into the camp and they tear up the roads, and they destroy the water pipes, and they destroy the sewage pipes, and they leave the Star of David all over the camp to communicate to the besieged residents of these camps that they dominate, that it is their society, their people, who will have dominion over the Palestinian people. This is what I saw, and I could talk about much more in occupied Palestine. In Lebanon, during my 3 visits, during the past 8 months of horror, I saw with my own eyes areas that had been struck by white phosphorus. We visited the town of Bint Jbeil in South Lebanon, known as the capital of resistance. And while we were there, an Israeli drone struck the entrance to another hospital and killed 3 innocent men, including a father in front of his son. His son, at the moment we arrived there, had been medevaced to Beirut to receive life-preserving surgery. We don't know ultimately what his fate was. We saw that the drone strike had left pockmarks on vehicles dozens of meters away. The shrapnel had basically penetrated metal dozens of meters away. This was at the entrance to the hospital. And then we spoke to the director of civil defense for South Lebanon, and he told us that something in the range of 13 of his medical workers had been assassinated by Israel, that Israel had destroyed multiple ambulances, and that the use of white phosphorus was widespread. They were trying, basically, the Israelis, to destroy the forests in South Lebanon on the pretext that they were being used by the militants of Hezbollah. And we, at one point, while situated several kilometers from the border of northern Palestine and Lebanon, within view of the Israeli military base at Metula, we were visited by an Israeli airstrike, which is one of the most horrifying experiences I ever had. It happened within a kilometer of the place where we were staying, and I must say that I can't imagine what it's like to be a Palestinian child in Gaza and to have to deal with that horror every single day, multiple times a day. All that I witnessed as a martyras changed me profoundly. Although I've acknowledged for many years that Palestinians have a right to armed resistance, I used to counsel against their use of that right because I believed that the use of that right would ultimately end in their destruction. But Western governments and their Israeli proxy have deprived Palestinians of all peaceful paths to justice. Never was that clearer than it is now. After 8 months of the horrors that we have witnessed, what could possibly be worse, my friends, than what we have witnessed during the past 8 months? In our lifetimes, have we seen this many protests for any cause in this country? I have not. I'm 60 years old. Nothing even comes close. We have a decision by the International Criminal Court prosecutor, who is a pro-Western proxy, under pressure to finally indict the Israeli Prime Minister and the Israeli Defense Minister. He should have indicted many more. He should have accused them of genocide. He didn't. We have the decisions of the International Court of Justice. We have multiple human rights organizations documenting every manner of atrocity committed against the people of Gaza. Over 16,000 children murdered, and what has changed? What has changed in the government policies here in Canada, the United States, Western Europe? Nothing. Nothing has changed. For decades, our brothers and sisters in Palestine engaged in this fraudulent peace process. And all the while, the Israelis were building settlements across the West Bank, the little land that was left to them and reserved for a Palestinian state, declaring Jerusalem as their capital in violation of international law. There are now some 700 to 800,000 settlers living illegally in the land that was reserved, the little spit of land that was reserved for the Palestinian people. So what do we know? We know that this process was fraudulent, and now the Israeli government doesn't even pretend to be willing to give the Palestinian people a state. It openly rejects that. We saw several years ago that the Palestinians in Gaza, when they marched up to the fence separating them from their homeland and sought peacefully to exercise their right of return, which is guaranteed to them under international law, that they were shot, mercilessly gunned down. Medics, journalists, disabled persons, children, women, mercilessly gunned down as the international community stood by and did nothing. One of the persons who was shot was a Canadian-Palestinian doctor by the name of Tarek Lubani. He was out in the field to deal with wounded civilians wearing medical garb. He was clearly marked as medical personnel, and he was shot twice in the legs by an Israeli sniper. A medic on his team was shot in the chest and killed that day. And what did the Canadian government do? Within 3 weeks, it entered into an enhanced free trade agreement with Israel. And they brought the Minister of the Economy, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Eli Cohen, at the outset of this genocide, to Canada and feted him on Bay Street within weeks of this Palestinian-Canadian doctor having been gunned down by the murderous Israeli military in Gaza. All peaceful options have been deprived to the Palestinian people. The key to their survival is armed resistance.
Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Israel!
As a practical matter, the choice now confronting our brothers and sisters in Palestine is passive acquiescence in their own destruction or the use of force. The most fundamental right that every human being has as a moral matter, as a matter of natural justice, is the right to live, and the right not only to survive, but also to live in dignity and health. Unless Palestinians resist their oppressor by force, they will be deprived of that most fundamental of human rights. The right to armed resistance is not only a moral right, it's not only a right of natural justice, it is also a lawful right. As written by British barrister Mark Mueller QC, according to international law, states may not use force against the lawful exercise of self-determination, while those seeking self-determination may use military force if there is no other way to achieve their goals, and if the last several decades of horror and fraud and lies have taught us anything, it's that there is no other way for the Palestinian people to achieve peace and justice and simply to survive. Until now, Palestinian activists in this country and in other Western states have erred fundamentally, and I participated fully in that mistake. We refused to discuss the right of armed resistance. We were afraid to speak about the brave Palestinian fighters who took up arms to defend their children, their homeland, their homes, their schools, their universities. You can distinguish between those because some of them have exceeded the bounds of the laws of war, and they should be held accountable. But you can distinguish between those acts that exceeded the bounds of the laws of war, and at the same time recognize that targeting the military that is murdering your children is an entirely legitimate, moral, and lawful use of one's resources in order to survive.
Yes. Yes.
A few days ago, you may have heard that an Israeli soldier was stabbed to death by a Palestinian from northern occupied Palestine in a shopping mall in what is now called northern Israel. The Israeli government acknowledged that he was a soldier, and yet it did not hesitate to characterize the killing as an act of terrorism. Now let's imagine that this same killer was a Ukrainian, and that the soldier was a Russian soldier on Ukrainian soil. Would they have called him a terrorist?
No, he'd be a hero. No.
He would be a hero. They would name streets after him. They would give him medals posthumously. They would celebrate him every year on the day that he died. But because he's a Palestinian, he's a terrorist.
Zionism is racism. Down with Zionism. Down with Zionism.
A few days ago, I had the honor to interview a comrade from the Palestinian community, Ali Abunimah, who many of you may know is a co-founder of Electronic Intifada, and I talked to him about the right to armed resistance. And in a 2021 article titled, "It's Time to Change the Liberal Discourse About Hamas," he wrote, quote, "To place violence by Palestinian resistance groups in the same category as that of the colonial occupier or of the United States is to engage in reprehensible moral equivalence. It's no different to those who cry all lives matter when confronted with the reality of systemic racism and police violence against black people in the United States. Yes, the lives of all human beings matter, but the responsibility for the violence that takes those lives is not equally shared. without a clear diagnosis of where the responsibility lies, and in Palestine the root cause of all political violence is Zionist colonization, there can be no hope for a just peace that brings it to an end. I completely concur with my brother Ali Abunimah. The last thing I want to say is that this right to armed resistance, although it's coming with a terrible, terrible cost to the Palestinian people, so much blood is shed and so much more blood is likely to be shed tragically, I believe that they are winning.
Yes.
They are winning because their cause is just.
Resistance is justified.
When people are occupied.
Resistance is justified.
When people are occupied.
Resistance is justified.
When people are occupied.
Resistance is justified.
They are winning because their cause is just, because that land is something that they will never let go of. It is fundamental to the identity of the Palestinian people, and because they are prepared to pay any price, including the sacrifice of their own lives, in order to have dignity and justice. Thank you very much, my friends.